My name is Claire Morrison, I'm 34 years old, and I've spent most of my adult life believing that love meant making yourself small enough to fit into other people's expectations. Tonight at my sister's engagement party, I learned how wrong I was. The invitation arrived 3 weeks ago, cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing that probably cost more than I spend on groceries in a month. Jessica and David invite you to celebrate their engagement, it read in elegant script, followed by the address of the Riverside Country Club. No mention that I should bring a +1, no acknowledgement that I might have someone important enough to include. Just my name printed in that same flowing script, looking somehow smaller than everyone else's. I should have known then what kind of evening it would be. If you've ever been betrayed by those you loved most, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. Hit that like and subscribe button if you're ready to hear how I finally stood up for myself after years of manipulation. The country club parking lot was full of luxury cars that gleamed under the amber streetlights. BMWs, Mercedes, a few Teslas scattered among them like technological punctuation marks in a sentence written entirely in German engineering. I pulled my 7-year-old Honda Civic into a spot between two SUVs that cost more than my annual salary and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the party already in full swing. Women in cocktail dresses that probably required appointments at exclusive boutiques, men in suits that fit like they were born wearing them. And there, in the center of it all, was Jessica. Even from the parking lot, she seemed to glow, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her red dress hugging curves that 2 personal trainers and a nutritionist had helped her maintain since high school. I looked down at my own dress, a navy blue number I'd bought on sale at Nordstrom Rack 6 months ago. It was nice enough, professional, appropriate. But standing next to Jessica's designer everything, I might as well have shown up in burlap. The security guard at the door checked my name against a list, his finger trailing down the page longer than seemed necessary. For a moment, I wondered if I'd been forgotten entirely, if this was all some elaborate mistake. But then he found it near the bottom and waved me through with the kind of smile reserved for people who clearly don't belong but are being tolerated anyway. The main ballroom had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, if fairy tales were sponsored by luxury brands and came with a minimum net worth requirement. White roses cascaded from every surface, crystal chandeliers threw rainbow patterns across the walls, and a string quartet played softly in one corner. The guest list read like a who's who of Chicago's elite, people whose names appeared regularly in the society pages, and whose donations kept half the city's cultural institutions running. I recognized some faces from Jessica's social media posts, people she'd gone to college with at Northwestern, colleagues from her marketing firm, friends she'd made at yoga retreats in Costa Rica and wine tours through Napa. Beautiful people with easy smiles and confident postures, people who'd never had to check their bank balance before ordering an appetizer or calculate whether they could afford to fill up their gas tank. Claire! Oh my God, you made it! Jessica appeared beside me like a vision in silk and perfume, her arms extended for an air kiss that barely disturbed her makeup. Up close, she looked even more perfect than she had from across the room. Her dress probably cost more than I made in 3 months, her jewelry was definitely real, and her smile had that practiced quality that came from years of social events and networking dinners. "Congratulations," I said, and I meant it. Despite everything, despite the complicated knot of emotions that lived permanently in my chest when it came to my sister, I was happy for her. She'd found someone who loved her, someone who could give her the life she'd always wanted. That had to count for something. "Thank you. I'm so glad you could make it. I know how busy you are with work and everything." She said work the way other people might say unfortunate medical condition, with a kind of polite sympathy that made it clear she didn't really understand what I did or why it mattered. "I'm a social worker at Chicago Public Schools, specializing in crisis intervention for at-risk youth. It's not glamorous work. The pay is terrible, the hours are long, and most days I come home feeling like I'm trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. But it matters. Every kid I help graduate instead of drop out, every suicide attempt I prevent, every family I help navigate the system matters. Not that anyone at this party would understand that. "Where's David?" I asked, scanning the crowd for Jessica's fiancé. I'd only met him twice before, both times at family dinners where he'd spent most of the evening talking about his hedge fund and making jokes I didn't understand about market volatility. "Oh, he's over there talking to his business partners. You know how men are at these things, always networking." Jessica's laugh tinkled like wind chimes. "Come on, let me introduce you to some people." The next hour passed in a blur of introductions to people whose names I immediately forgot and conversations about things I couldn't afford to care about. Vacation homes in the Hamptons, private schools for children who weren't even born yet, investment strategies that assumed you had money to invest in the first place. I smiled and nodded and made appropriate sounds at appropriate times, but I felt like an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. "And what do you do?" became a question I learned to dread. Social work didn't translate well to this crowd. They'd get that slightly glazed look people get when confronted with someone else's altruism, like I was speaking a language they'd heard of but never bothered to learn. Then they'd make polite comments about how noble it was, how they could never do that kind of work themselves, before quickly changing the subject to something more comfortable. I was standing by the bar, nursing my second glass of wine and contemplating how early I could leave without seeming rude, when I overheard a conversation that stopped me cold. "Well, of course Jessica's parents are paying for everything," a woman in a silver dress was saying to her companion. "I heard the wedding alone is costing them over $200,000. Can you imagine?" "That's nothing compared to what they spend on that condo downtown," her friend replied. "And didn't they buy her that BMW for her birthday last year?" I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, the one that always came when I was reminded of the fundamental difference between Jessica and me. Not just that she was prettier or more successful or better at playing the social game, but that she'd always been the chosen one. The daughter our parents invested in, literally and figuratively. When Jessica graduated from Northwestern, our parents paid off her student loans as a graduation gift. When she wanted to start her own marketing consultancy, they provided the seed money. When she and David decided they needed a bigger place, Mom and Dad helped with the down payment on a penthouse condo that cost more than most people's houses. When I graduated from the University of Illinois with a degree in social work, my parents attended the ceremony and took me out to dinner at Olive Garden. When I told them I wanted to work with at-risk kids in Chicago's public school system, they worried it was too dangerous and suggested I consider private practice instead. When I struggled to make rent on my studio apartment, they offered to loan me money at a reasonable interest rate, like I was a business opportunity rather than their daughter. I'm not bitter about it. That's what I tell myself, anyway. Jessica had always been the easy child, the one who fit their vision of success. Beautiful, ambitious, socially adept, interested in things that made sense to them. I was the complicated one, the idealist, the daughter who cared more about making a difference than making money. Of course they'd invest more heavily in the sure bet. But standing there in that ballroom, surrounded by the evidence of their generosity toward Jessica, I felt something crack open inside me. Not bitterness exactly. Something deeper and more painful. The realization that I'd spent my entire adult life trying to prove I deserved the same kind of support they gave her freely and failing. "Claire." Jessica appeared beside me again, slightly breathless from working the room. "I've been looking for you. David wanted to meet you properly." She led me across the room to where her fiancé stood with a group of men in expensive suits. David Turner was everything Jessica had always said she wanted in a husband: tall, handsome, successful, from a good family. He had the kind of confidence that came from never doubting that the world would bend to accommodate his needs. "David, this is my sister Claire I told you about." He turned toward me with a smile that was warm but somehow didn't reach his eyes. "Claire, Jessica talks about you all the time. You're the one who works with kids, right?" "I'm a social worker," I said, shaking his hand. "I work in the Chicago public school system." "That's amazing," he said, with the kind of enthusiasm people reserve for describing things they find admirable but would never want to do themselves. "Jessica tells me you're incredibly dedicated." really making a difference. I wondered what exactly Jessica had told him about me. Probably the sanitized version she'd constructed over the years, the one that made my choices seem noble rather than impractical, devoted rather than stubborn. "And what about you?" I asked. "Jessica mentioned you work in finance?" "I run a hedge fund," he said, and I could see him mentally calculating whether I was worth explaining what that meant. "We focus on emerging markets, mostly. It's complex work but rewarding." "I'm sure it is," I said, though I wasn't sure of anything except that whatever he did for a living had bought him the kind of life Jessica had always wanted. "Actually," David continued, glancing at Jessica, "I've been meaning to ask you about something. Jessica mentioned you might be looking for a change of pace career-wise." I felt Jessica tense beside me, and I knew immediately that this conversation had been planned. Rehearsed, probably, during one of their long discussions about what to do about Claire and her impractical life choices. "I wasn't aware I was looking for a change," I said carefully. "Well, I have a friend who runs a nonprofit," David continued, seemingly oblivious to the ice in my voice. "It's focused on education reform, very high-level strategic work. They're always looking for people with your background, and the pay is significantly better than public sector work. I could make some calls if you're interested." The offer hung in the air between us like a bridge I was supposed to be grateful for. A way out of my small, difficult life into something that made more sense to people like them. Better pay, better working conditions, work that came with prestige rather than pitying looks. "That's very thoughtful," I said, and I could hear Jessica release a small breath of relief. "But I'm happy where I am." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when someone says something that doesn't compute. David's smile faltered slightly, and Jessica's expression shifted into something I recognized from childhood, the look she got when I refused to be reasonable about something. "Claire," Jessica said, her voice taking on the patient tone she might use with a stubborn child, "you can't spend your whole life sacrificing yourself for other people. You deserve to have nice things too." The word deserve hit me like a physical blow. As if the only reason I didn't have nice things was because I hadn't been smart enough to choose a career that paid better. As if my work was a form of self-imposed martyrdom rather than a calling. "I like my work," I said simply. "But think about your future," David chimed in. "Retirement, financial security, being able to help your own family someday. You can't do that on a social worker's salary." I wanted to tell him that I'd been thinking about my future every day for the past 12 years, that I'd made peace with the trade-offs a long time ago. That not everyone measured success by the size of their retirement account or the thread count of their sheets. But before I could formulate a response, the lights dimmed and someone tapped a microphone at the front of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please." The crowd quieted and turned toward the small stage where Jessica's father, Robert Morrison, stood behind a microphone. Even at 62, he was still an imposing figure, tall and silver-haired with the kind of presence that commanded attention in boardrooms and country clubs. He'd built a successful commercial real estate empire from nothing, the kind of American success story that looked better from a distance than it felt up close. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate Jessica and David," he began, his voice carrying easily through the room. "As most of you know, Jessica has always been the light of our family. From the time she was a little girl, we knew she was destined for great things." I felt something cold settle in my stomach as he continued, painting a picture of Jessica's childhood that was both accurate and completely false. Yes, she had been a beautiful child, gifted and charming and easy to love. But the story he was telling erased me entirely, as if I'd been nothing more than background scenery in the drama of Jessica's rise to greatness. "She graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern," he continued, "built a successful business from the ground up, and now she's found her perfect partner in David. We couldn't be prouder of the woman she's become." The crowd applauded, and I joined in because it would have been conspicuous not to. But my hands felt numb and I could hear my heart beating in my ears. I looked around the room and saw nothing but smiling faces, people who had no idea they were witnessing the casual erasure of half a family. "Now, I know Jessica doesn't like when we make a fuss," Dad continued, but I can't let this evening pass without acknowledging something. 3 years ago, when Jessica wanted to expand her business, she needed capital. A lot of capital. We were proud to invest in her vision, and tonight, I'm proud to announce that her company has just been acquired by Morrison Holdings for $12 million. The gasp that went through the crowd was audible. $12 million. I felt the number hit me like a truck, not because of the money itself, but because of what it represented. Jessica hadn't just been successful. She'd been successful enough that our father had bought her company to fold it into his own empire. She wasn't just his daughter anymore. She was his business partner, his legacy, the child worthy of inheriting everything he'd built. "So please," Dad said, raising his champagne flute, "join me in toasting not just Jessica and David's engagement, but Jessica's incredible achievement. To my brilliant daughter, who continues to make me proud every single day." The room erupted in applause. People raised their glasses and cheered, and Jessica glowed under the attention like she was meant for it. And maybe she was. Maybe this was always how the story was supposed to end, with her in the spotlight and me in the shadows, proud of her success but forever separate from it. I raised my own glass and took a sip of champagne that suddenly tasted like ash. $12 million. I tried to put that number in perspective, to understand what it meant. It was more money than I would make in my entire lifetime, even if I worked until I was 80. It was enough to buy a dozen houses, to fund 100 scholarships, to change hundreds of lives. It was also, I realized with a clarity that was both painful and liberating, a number that represented the fundamental difference between Jessica's dreams and mine. She dreamed in millions while I dreamed in saved lives. She built companies while I built relationships with kids who needed someone to believe in them. She was everything my parents had hoped for in a daughter, and I was something they'd learned to tolerate. The party continued around me, but I felt disconnected from it, like I was watching everything through glass. People congratulated Jessica, shook David's hand, made jokes about the wedding planning that lay ahead. I smiled and nodded when spoken to, but inside I was calculating how early I could leave without causing a scene. I was making my way toward the coat check when I heard my name called. I turned to find my mother approaching, elegant as always in a black cocktail dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Elizabeth Morrison had the kind of refined beauty that came from good genes, regular salon appointments, and a lifetime of never having to worry about money. "Claire, darling, there you are," she said, kissing my cheek with the same air kiss technique Jessica had mastered. "I've barely had a chance to talk to you all evening." "It's a beautiful party," I said, because it was true and because I didn't know what else to say. "Isn't it? Jessica has such wonderful taste. And did you hear your father's announcement? $12 million. I still can't quite believe it." I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I tried to speak. "Of course, we always knew Jessica would be successful," Mom continued. "Even when she was little, she had such drive, such ambition. Remember how she used to organize those elaborate tea parties for her dolls? She'd make little business cards and everything." I remembered those tea parties. I also remembered being relegated to the role of server, the one who brought the cookies and cleaned up afterward while Jessica played the gracious hostess. But pointing that out now would only make me sound petty. "And what about you, dear?" Mom asked, with the kind of bright interest that suggested she was fulfilling a social obligation rather than expressing genuine curiosity. "How's work going?" "It's good," I said. "Challenging but good." "I'm sure it is. You work so hard, Claire. Sometimes I worry you work too hard. You know, Jessica was just telling me about an opportunity David mentioned. Something in the nonprofit sector that might be a better fit for you." There it was again, the assumption that my life needed fixing, that the choices I'd made were somehow temporary or misguided. As if I'd stumbled into social work by accident and had been waiting all these years for someone to offer me something better. "I'm happy where I am," I said, echoing what I'd told David earlier. Mom's smile flickered for just a moment. "Of course, dear. But you know, there's nothing wrong with wanting more for yourself. You're 34 years old and you deserve to have the same kind of success Jessica has." That word again. Deserve. As if success was a reward handed out by the universe to people who made the right choices, rather than something that depended on privilege and luck and 1,000 factors beyond anyone's control. Success means different things to different people, I said carefully. Well, yes, of course, Mom said, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. In her world, success had a very specific definition: money, status, the kind of life that looked good in holiday cards and social media posts. The idea that someone might actively choose something different was as foreign to her as speaking Mandarin. Excuse me, I said, spotting my escape route. I should probably head home soon. Early day tomorrow. Oh, but you can't leave yet. Mom protested. We haven't even had cake, and Jessica wanted to show everyone the ring David designed for her. It's absolutely stunning. I looked across the room to where Jessica was indeed showing off her engagement ring to a group of admirers. Even from a distance, I could see it was enormous, the kind of ring that required its own insurance policy and regular trips to the jeweler for professional cleaning. It's beautiful, I said and meant it. But I really should go. Mom's face fell slightly. Are you sure? It just feels like we never see you anymore. That was rich, considering they saw me exactly as often as they always had, at Christmas, Easter, Jessica's birthday parties, and whatever other family obligations couldn't be avoided. The difference was that now I was old enough to recognize the pattern, to understand that their interest in my presence had more to do with maintaining the appearance of family unity than any genuine desire for my company. I'll call you next week, I said, kissing her cheek. Tell Dad I said congratulations on the acquisition. I was almost to the door when Jessica caught up with me, slightly out of breath from hurrying across the room in heels. You're leaving already? She asked, and for a moment she looked genuinely disappointed. But we haven't even had a chance to really talk. I know, I'm sorry. I just have to be up early tomorrow. For work, she said, and something in her tone made me look at her more carefully. There was an expression on her face I couldn't quite read, something between frustration and concern. Yes, for work. Claire, she said, stepping closer and lowering her voice, can I ask you something? And will you promise to give me an honest answer? I nodded, though I had a feeling I wasn't going to like whatever she was about to say. Are you happy? She asked. I mean, really happy? Because sometimes when I look at your life, it seems like you're just treading water. Like you're stuck. The question hit me harder than I expected. Not because it was cruel, but because it was asked with what seemed like genuine concern. For a moment, I saw myself through Jessica's eyes, 34 years old, living alone in a studio apartment, working a job that paid barely enough to cover my expenses, with no husband, no children, no obvious markers of success or progress. I'm happy, I said, and realized I was telling the truth. Not completely happy, not happiness without complications or doubts, but fundamentally content with the choices I'd made. My life isn't what you choose, but it's what I choose. But don't you want more? She pressed. Don't you want to travel, to own a home, to not have to worry about money all the time? Of course I do, I said. But I also want to wake up every morning knowing that what I do matters. I want to work with kids who need someone in their corner. I want to use my skills to help people who don't have other options. That's worth more to me than a big salary or a fancy car. Jessica stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her trying to understand how we'd grown up in the same house and developed such different definitions of what mattered. I just worry about you, she said finally. I worry that you're sacrificing too much of your own happiness for other people. And I worry that you think happiness can only look one way, I replied, more gently than I felt. Your happiness, Jess, not everyone's. She was quiet for a moment, and I could see her processing this idea. Finally, she nodded slowly. I love you, you know, she said. Even if I don't always understand you. I love you too, I said, and hugged her properly for the first time all evening. Congratulations on everything. The engagement, the business, all of it. I really am proud of you. Thank you, she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. That means more than you know. I left the country club feeling lighter than I had all evening, but also strangely hollow. The drive home through Chicago's late-night streets gave me time to think, to process what I'd experienced and what it meant. Jessica's engagement party had been a celebration of everything I wasn't and would never be. Beautiful, wealthy, socially connected, romantically successful. But it had also been a reminder of everything I was, someone who'd chosen purpose over profit, meaning over money, impact over image. The problem wasn't that my family didn't love me. They did in their way. The problem was that they loved me despite who I was rather than because of it. They saw my choices as obstacles to be overcome rather than expressions of my deepest values. They wanted to fix me rather than understand me. My apartment, when I finally reached it, felt smaller and shabbier than usual after an evening surrounded by luxury. One room that served as bedroom, living room, and office, with a kitchen barely large enough for one person and a bathroom that had seen better decades. But it was mine, paid for with money I'd earned doing work that mattered, and that had to count for something. I changed into pajamas and made myself a cup of tea, then sat on my narrow bed with my laptop. I had 3 emails from parents of students I worked with, 2 requiring responses tonight. Marcus Washington's mother wanted to know if I could recommend a tutor for his math class. Sophia Chen's father was worried about her depression symptoms and wanted to schedule a family meeting. DeAndre Johnson's grandmother needed help navigating the special education services application. These were my people, I realized as I typed responses. Not the country club crowd with their investment portfolios and vacation homes, but the families who trusted me with their children's futures. Parents who worked 2 jobs and still struggled to make ends meet, kids who faced challenges that made my family drama seem trivial by comparison. I thought about Marcus, 15 years old and already 6 feet tall, who'd been bounced between foster homes since he was 7, but still showed up to school every day with a smile. About Sophia, brilliant and artistic and battling anxiety so severe it sometimes left her unable to speak. About DeAndre, who had autism and a gift for mathematics that might someday take him places no one in his family had ever imagined. These kids didn't care that I drove a Honda Civic or lived in a studio apartment. They cared that I listened to them, that I believed in them, that I fought for them when everyone else had given up. They cared that I saw their potential instead of their problems, their strengths instead of their deficits. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Hi Claire, this is David. Jessica gave me your number. I hope you don't mind. I wanted to follow up on our conversation about the nonprofit opportunity. My friend is very interested in meeting you. Are you free for lunch this week?" I stared at the message for a long time before typing back. "Thank you for thinking of me, but I'm not looking to make a change right now." His response came quickly. "Are you sure? The salary range is 80 to 100K, full benefits, and much better work-life balance than public sector. At least think about it. $80 to $100,000. More than double what I made now. Enough to move to a real apartment, to take vacations, to stop calculating whether I could afford groceries and rent in the same week." It was a generous offer, genuinely meant to help, and I was touched that David had thought of me. But it was also a solution to a problem I didn't have. I wasn't miserable in my work, I was fulfilled by it. I didn't need rescue, I needed recognition that my choices were valid even if they were different. "I'm sure," I typed back. "But I appreciate you thinking of me." I set the phone aside and finished responding to the parent emails, then spent an hour reviewing case files for the next day. It was past midnight when I finally turned off the light, but I felt more centered than I had in weeks. The engagement party had been a reminder of the gap between my life and my family's expectations, but it had also been a reminder of why I'd chosen this path in the first place. Every family gathering, every well-meaning suggestion about my career, every pitying look when I mentioned my salary was part of the price I paid for living according to my own values rather than theirs. It wasn't an easy price to pay. There were nights when I lay awake wondering what it would be like to have Jessica's confidence, her success, her certainty that the world was arranged to accommodate her dreams. There were moments when I felt the weight of being different, of being the child who'd chosen the harder path. But there were also moments like the one I'd had that evening with Jessica, when I'd been able to articulate why my choices mattered to me. Moments when I felt proud of the life I'd built, small and imperfect as it was. Moments when I knew with absolute certainty that I was exactly where I belonged. I drifted off to sleep thinking about Monday morning, about the kids who would walk into my office looking for someone who believed in them. About Marcus and Sophia and DeAndre and all the others whose names I carried with me like prayers. About the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the most radical thing I could do was continue being exactly who I was, regardless of who thought I should be someone else. The morning brought new challenges and familiar rewards. Marcus had been arrested over the weekend for fighting with another boy who'd been bullying his younger sister. Sophia's parents wanted to pull her out of school entirely, convinced that homeschooling would solve her anxiety. DeAndre's grandmother had received a letter from the district suggesting he might need to be transferred to a different school with more specialized services. Each situation required careful navigation, diplomatic conversations with administrators and teachers, patient explanations to parents who were frightened for their children's futures. This was the work that David's hedge fund friends couldn't understand, the work that didn't show up on balance sheets or quarterly reports. The work of seeing human beings as more than statistics, of fighting systems that were designed to sort and label rather than nurture and support. By the time I got home that evening, I was exhausted but satisfied. Marcus would stay in school with additional counseling support. Sophia's parents had agreed to try therapy before making any drastic changes. DeAndre's grandmother had decided to advocate for keeping him in his current school with enhanced services rather than transferring him. Small victories, the kind that might seem insignificant to someone looking from the outside. But I'd learned that small victories were what changed lives, one decision at a time, one child at a time. My phone rang as I was heating up leftover pasta for dinner. Jessica's name appeared on the screen, and I felt a familiar mix of affection and apprehension as I answered. "Hey," I said. "How are you feeling after last night? Not too hungover, I hope." "I'm fine," she said, but something in her voice suggested otherwise. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something. Are you free to meet for coffee? Tonight? If you can. I know it's last minute, but there's something I need to tell you and I'd rather do it in person." An hour later, I found myself sitting across from Jessica in a trendy coffee shop near her condo, watching her fidget with her engagement ring. She looked different than she had the night before, less polished somehow, more vulnerable. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," she began, "about happiness looking different for different people." I nodded, waiting for her to continue. "The thing is, I'm not sure I know what my happiness looks like anymore," she said quietly. "I know what success looks like, what achievement looks like, what other people's approval looks like. But happiness? I'm not sure I've ever really thought about it." This wasn't what I'd expected to hear from the woman who'd seemed so confident and radiant just 24 hours earlier. "What do you mean?" I asked gently. Jessica was quiet for a long moment, staring into her latte as if it might contain answers. "Do you remember when we were kids?" she said finally, "and I used to have those elaborate tea parties for my dolls?" "Of course." "I never actually liked those tea parties," she said, and the admission seemed to surprise her as much as it did me. "I thought I was supposed to like them. Mom was always talking about how important social skills were, how I needed to learn to be a good hostess. So I did what I thought she wanted me to do." I felt something shift in my understanding of our childhood, like a kaleidoscope being turned to reveal a new pattern. "What did you actually like?" I asked. "I liked building things," she said, so quietly I almost didn't hear her. "Remember that summer when Dad was renovating the basement, and I spent hours down there with him, learning how to use tools? I loved that. I wanted to be an architect or maybe an engineer. I used to draw house plans in my notebooks." I did remember that summer, though I'd forgotten it until she mentioned it. I remembered being jealous that Dad was spending so much time with Jessica, teaching her things he'd never taught me. "What happened to those dreams?" I asked. "They weren't practical," Jessica said with a bitter laugh. "At least that's what Mom said. She said architecture was too male-dominated, too competitive. She said I should focus on business instead, something where my people skills would be an asset. So you studied marketing? I studied what I thought would make them proud, she corrected. And it worked. They were proud. But somewhere along the way I lost track of what I actually wanted. We sat in silence for a while, processing this revelation. I thought about all the years I'd envied Jessica for her ease with our parents' approval, never realizing that approval had come at the cost of her own authentic desires. Is that why you wanted to talk to me? I asked finally. To tell me about the architecture thing? Partly, she said. But also because I realized something else. When David made that offer to you last night about the nonprofit job, you turned it down without even thinking about it. And I was so frustrated because I couldn't understand why you wouldn't want something better. And now? Now I think maybe you already have something better, she said. Not better in terms of money or prestige, but better in terms of alignment, I guess. Between who you are and what you do. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. It's not too late, you know, I said. To figure out what you actually want, I mean. You're getting married to someone you love, you have financial security, you could pursue architecture if that's what you really want. Jessica shook her head. I don't think David would understand. His whole life is about upward mobility, about being more successful than his parents were. If I told him I wanted to go back to school to study architecture, he'd think I was having some kind of breakdown. Maybe you need to have that conversation with him, I suggested. Maybe he'd surprise you. Maybe, she said, but she didn't sound convinced. Or maybe it really is too late. Maybe I've built a life that only works if I keep being the person everyone expects me to be. I wanted to tell her that it was never too late, that she could change course at any time, that the only person's approval she needed was her own. But I also understood the weight of other people's expectations, the way they could become like gravity, holding you in place even when you wanted to fly. For what it's worth, I said, I think you'd be a brilliant architect. She smiled for the first time since we'd sat down. You always believed in me, you know that? Even when we were kids, even when I was being awful to you, you always thought I could do anything. You can do anything, I said. The question is what you want to do. We talked for another hour, reminiscing about childhood memories that looked different in light of this new understanding. Jessica walked me to my car when we finally decided to call it a night. Thank you, she said as I unlocked my Honda. For listening, for not saying I told you so, for just being you. Thank you for trusting me with this, I replied. And Jess? Whatever you decide to do, I'll support you. Even if Mom and Dad don't understand at first. She hugged me tightly, and for the first time in years, it felt like we were sisters rather than strangers who happened to share DNA. The drive home gave me time to process what Jessica had told me. All these years, I'd assumed she was living her dream life, pursuing her passions with the full support of our parents. The reality was more complicated. She'd been performing a version of success rather than living it, just like I'd been performing a version of contentment at family gatherings. The difference was that my performance had eventually fallen away, revealing something authentic underneath. Jessica was still discovering what lay beneath her perfectly constructed facade. 2 weeks later, I was in my office reviewing college application essays with a group of seniors when my phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. Can you talk? Something happened. I stepped into the hallway to call her back, concerned by the urgency in her message. What's wrong? I asked as soon as she answered. I did something crazy, she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. I applied to graduate school. That's not crazy, I said, relieved that whatever crisis I'd imagined wasn't materializing. That's wonderful. What program? Architecture, she whispered, as if saying it too loudly might make it disappear. The University of Chicago has a Master of Architecture program for people who didn't study it as undergraduates. I found out about it last week and the application deadline was today, and I submitted it. I felt a smile spread across my face. Jessica, that's incredible. I'm so proud of you. I haven't told anyone else yet, she said. Not David, not Mom and Dad. I'm terrified they'll think I've lost my mind. Have you lost your mind? I asked. She was quiet for a moment. Maybe a little. But it feels good. Scary but good. Like I'm finally doing something because I want to, not because I think I should. That's not crazy, I said. That's the sanest thing I've heard in a long time. We talked for a few more minutes before I had to get back to my students, but I spent the rest of the day thinking about the courage it must have taken for Jessica to submit that application. She was risking everything she'd built to pursue something that mattered to her, even though she had no guarantee it would work out. That evening, I was grading papers when my phone rang again. This time it was my mother. Claire, dear, I need to talk to you about Jessica, she said without preamble. She's having some kind of quarter-life crisis. She's 31, Mom. That would be more like a third-life crisis. This isn't funny, Mom said sharply. She told David she wants to go back to school to study architecture, of all things. Architecture. Can you imagine? She has a perfectly successful business, she's about to get married, and she wants to throw it all away to play with building blocks. I took a deep breath, counting to 5 before responding. Did she tell you why she wants to study architecture? She said something about it being her childhood dream, but honestly, Claire, we all have childhood dreams. The point of growing up is learning to be realistic about what's possible. What if what's possible is bigger than what we originally thought? I asked. What do you mean? I mean, maybe Jessica is finally figuring out who she really is, separate from who everyone else wanted her to be. Maybe that's something to celebrate rather than something to fix. There was a long pause. Claire, I'm concerned about your influence on your sister. Ever since that engagement party, she's been different. More argumentative, more questioning of decisions that were already made. I can't help but think your conversation that night put ideas in her head. I felt a familiar anger rise in my chest, but I pushed it down. You're right, I said. I did put an idea in her head. The idea that she has the right to pursue her own dreams. Dreams don't pay the bills, Mom said crisply. Dreams don't provide financial security or social stability. Your sister has worked very hard to build a life that makes sense, and now she wants to tear it all down for some fantasy about becoming an architect. What if it's not a fantasy? I asked. What if she's actually good at it? What if she could be happy doing something she's passionate about? Happiness is a luxury, Mom said, and I could hear the finality in her voice. Some people can afford to chase their dreams, Claire, but most of us have to be practical. Jessica has responsibilities now. To David, to the family, to the life they're planning together. After she hung up, I sat in my small apartment thinking about responsibility and dreams, and the ways we limit ourselves by accepting other people's definitions of what's possible. I thought about my own choices, about the years I'd spent justifying my work to people who couldn't understand why anyone would choose purpose over profit. I thought about the kids I worked with, teenagers who faced obstacles that made Jessica's family pressure seem trivial, but who still dared to dream of college, of careers, of lives beyond what their circumstances suggested was possible. If they could be brave enough to reach for something better, surely Jessica could too. The next day, I found myself doing something I'd never done before. I called Jessica and invited her to visit me at work. Really? She said, sounding surprised. You want me to come to your school? I want you to see what I do, I said. I want you to understand why I chose this, and maybe you'll understand why choosing architecture isn't crazy either. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon, looking polished and professional in a way that made her stand out among the teenagers streaming through the hallways. I met her at the main office and gave her a visitor's badge, then led her through the maze of corridors to my small office. This is where I spend most of my time, I said, gesturing to the cramped space with its mismatched furniture and walls covered in student artwork and college pennants. Not exactly the Riverside Country Club. Jessica looked around with genuine interest, taking in the details. the stack of college applications on my desk, the box of granola bars I kept for students who missed lunch, the small coffee maker that was technically against school policy but had never been confiscated. "It's perfect," she said, and I could tell she meant it. "It feels like you." Before I could respond, there was a knock on my door. Marcus Washington poked his head in, looking slightly sheepish. "Ms. Morrison? Do you have a minute? I know I don't have an appointment, but—" "Of course," I said. "Marcus, this is my sister Jessica. Jessica, this is Marcus, one of my students." Marcus nodded politely at Jessica, then turned back to me. "I got into state," he said, and his grin was so wide I thought his face might split in half. "Full scholarship. Academic and partial athletic." I felt tears spring to my eyes. Marcus had been working toward this moment for 3 years, maintaining a 3.8 GPA while working 20 hours a week at a grocery store to help support his grandmother. The scholarship represented not just college admission, but a complete transformation of his life trajectory. "Marcus, that's incredible," I said, jumping up to hug him. "I'm so proud of you. Tell me everything." For the next 10 minutes, Marcus shared details about his acceptance letter, his scholarship package, his plans for studying computer engineering. Jessica listened quietly, but I could see her taking in every word, watching the interaction between us. After Marcus left, practically floating down the hallway, Jessica was quiet for a long moment. "That's why you do this," she said finally. "Not the paycheck or the benefits or the job security. That moment right there." "That's exactly why I do this," I confirmed. "Marcus is going to be the first person in his family to graduate from college. He's going to have opportunities his parents never dreamed of. And I gotta be part of making that happen." "Does it always work out that way?" Jessica asked. I shook my head. "No. Sometimes kids drop out or don't get accepted or make choices I wish they wouldn't make. Sometimes I feel like I'm fighting a system that's designed to fail them. But the success stories like Marcus make all the rest worth it." We talked for another hour about my work, about the challenges and rewards of working within the public education system. Jessica asked thoughtful questions, and I could see her beginning to understand not just what I did but why it mattered to me. As we were leaving the building, we passed a bulletin board covered with photos of graduates from the past 5 years. Some were in caps and gowns, others in military uniforms or work clothes. All of them were smiling, and many had written thank you notes to the teachers and counselors who had helped them along the way. "My gosh, Claire," Jessica said, stopping in front of the board. "Look at all these lives you've touched." "We've all touched them," I corrected. "It takes a whole team to help a kid succeed. But yes, I'm proud of each of these faces." Jessica studied the photos for a long time, reading the thank you notes and college announcements. Finally, she turned to me with tears in her eyes. "I want this," she said quietly. "Not exactly this, but this feeling. The feeling that what I do matters, that I'm building something worthwhile." "You can have it," I said. "It might mean giving up some other things, but you can have it." "What did you have to give up?" she asked. I thought about the question seriously. "Financial security," I said. "A certain kind of lifestyle. The approval of some people who matter to me. The easy path." "Do you ever regret it?" "Never," I said, and realized I meant it completely. "Not once." That weekend, Jessica called to tell me she'd been accepted into the Master of Architecture program at University of Chicago. The admissions committee had been impressed by her business background and her portfolio of building designs she'd been secretly working on for months. "I'm going to do it," she said, and I could hear the determination in her voice. "I'm going to defer the wedding for a year, take out loans for school, and figure out how to be an architect." "What did David say?" I asked. "He's not thrilled," she admitted. "He thinks I'm throwing away everything we've worked for. But he said he'll support me if this is really what I want." "And Mom and Dad?" Jessica was quiet for a moment. "They're adjusting to the idea. Dad's actually more supportive than I expected. He said he admires my courage, even if he doesn't understand my logic." And Mom? Mom thinks I'm having a breakdown. She suggested I talk to a therapist before making any major life decisions. Maybe you should talk to a therapist, I said. Not because you're having a breakdown, but because major life transitions are hard, and it might help to have someone neutral to talk through all the changes. You know what? Jessica said. That's actually a good idea. Maybe it's time I figured out who I am when I'm not trying to be who everyone else wants me to be. 6 months later, I sat in the audience at Jessica's first architecture school presentation, watching her explain her design for a low-income housing complex that managed to be both beautiful and affordable. She was confident and passionate in a way I'd never seen before, speaking about sustainability and community impact with the same enthusiasm she'd once reserved for marketing campaigns. After her presentation, she found me in the hallway, still glowing with adrenaline. "What did you think?" she asked. "I think you found your calling," I said. "You were brilliant up there." "I feel like myself for the first time in years," she said. "It's scary and exciting and exhausting, but it's real. It's mine." We walked out of the building together, and I thought about how much both of our lives had changed since that engagement party. Jessica was pursuing her dreams despite the cost, and I was finally able to articulate why my own choices mattered without feeling defensive about them. "Can I tell you something?" Jessica said as we reached our cars. "Of course." That night at the engagement party, when you turned down David's job offer, I thought you were being stubborn and self-defeating. I couldn't understand why you wouldn't want something better. And now? Now I realize you weren't settling for less. You were holding out for more. More meaning, more alignment, more authenticity. And that's exactly what I'm trying to find too. I hugged her tightly, proud of the woman she was becoming and grateful for the relationship we were building. For the first time in our lives, we weren't competing for our parents' approval or trying to prove whose choices were better. We were just two sisters, supporting each other as we figured out how to live authentically in a world that often rewarded performance over truth. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the journey that had brought us both to this point. It hadn't been easy for either of us to choose authenticity over approval, purpose over prestige. But somewhere along the way, we'd both learned that the most radical thing we could do was be exactly who we were meant to be, regardless of who thought we should be someone else. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, who was now in his second year at State University. "Ms. Morrison, I made Dean's List again. Thank you for believing in me when no one else did." I smiled and typed back, "I'm proud of you, but not surprised. You've always had everything it takes." Then I added, "By the way, my sister is studying to be an architect. She's designing housing for people who need it most. I thought you'd appreciate knowing that dreams can come true at any age." His response came quickly, "That's awesome. Tell her an old foster kid said she's doing important work." I would tell her, I decided. And I would continue doing my own important work, helping kids like Marcus discover their potential and find their paths. It wasn't the life my parents had envisioned for me, but it was the life I'd chosen, and that made all the difference. The weight of silence had been heavy for so many years, but the weight of authenticity was different. It was substantial without being burdensome, meaningful without being overwhelming. It was the weight of a life lived on purpose, and I wouldn't trade it for anything.